On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I'm Bill Drummond, and your moderator for this evening. It is now my great pleasure to introduce tonight's guest. Franklin Foer is the editor of the New Republic and also the editor of the magazine's centennial anthology, Insurrections of the Mind, 100 Years of Politics and Culture in America. Foer is the author of the international bestseller, How Soccer Explains the World, An Unlikely Theory of Globalization, which has been translated into 27 languages. He is a senior fellow at the New American Foundation, a graduate of Columbia College, and a native Washingtonian. Ladies and gentlemen, here to speak to us about 100 years of politics and culture in America, please join me in welcoming Franklin Foer. Now, I'm going to exercise the prerogative of the moderator and ask the first question. We had a chance to talk briefly in what amounts to the green room, and I expressed a little bit of discomfort, maybe even despair, about the situation of politics in America today compared to the time when the New Republic was being born. It just seems like there was much more hope and optimism. Liberalism had meaning. And I was wondering if he shared this sentiment and if there's anything he could tell us about going through these wonderful articles in the early days of the New Republic that might shed some light on the predicament that we have with our politics today.
Thank you. Thank you for introduction, and great to be here. Maybe I could start by just telling the story of how the New Republic came into being, which might shed some light on some of the similarities and differences between our political eras. So the magazine was born. The first owner of the magazine was a woman called Dorothy Whitney Straight, and she was, the Whitney part is like the Whitney Museum in New York. She came from one of the great fortunes of her time. Her father had been very active in Democratic Party politics, and but ditched politics to become a robber baron. And he died sometime around 1907, just before it was exposed that the railroad that he owned had been involved in all sorts of horrible, corrupt behavior. And so Dorothy kind of came into all this money knowing that it came to her through ill-begotten means. And so she was shrouded in a bit of what you might call liberal guilt. And so she was in her teens when she came into her fortune, which gave her an incredible amount of freedom for a young woman of her time. And so she went off traveling around the world, and she became a bit of a bohemian. She gave money to settlement houses, and she was very independent-minded. And she traveled the world, and she was in China, and she met somebody else who had been orphaned, a young man who was called Willard Straight, who was a total self-made man. He'd come from upstate New York. His parents had died early. He'd been raised by one of the few women physicians in the country. He'd gone to Cornell, was an adventurer, went off to Japan, where he was a war correspondent, then met Averell Harriman in Tokyo, who said, hey, you should go become America's finance guy in China, which he kind of bamboozled his way into doing as a 20-something, and became close to the J.P. Morgan family. And Dorothy Whitney was traveling through the world, and she met this guy in China, and she just kind of fell for him, and he fell for her. And they were a couple that shared an incredible sense of optimism about the world and all sorts of intellectual interests. And they ended up getting married. And on their honeymoon, they read a very wonkish book together to one another. It was called The Promise of American Life. And it was written by a totally unlikely character called Herbert Croly. Croly also had an interesting familial background. He grew up in New York City, just as Dorothy Whitney had. His mother was the first advice columnist in the country, called Jenny June. And his father had been a newspaper editor, but he was a bit of a whack job. He had this mustache that went down to his shoulders, and he made these Nostradamus position. He called himself Sir Oracle. And he'd write these Nostradamus predictions in the newspaper. He was a bit eccentric. And this family, I hope I'm like, I began by filibustering and digressing. His family, his mother and father were devotees of a French philosopher called Auguste Comte, who was incredibly important at the time. He had a great influence on Marx and every other 19th century thinker. And Comte developed this whole theory of history, but he also fell in love with this woman, and he had a totally platonic relationship. And even though he could never get with this woman who was tubercular and dying, when she died, he claimed to be utterly crushed, and he went into a fit of depression, and he took his philosophy and he turned it into an actual religion called the religion of humanity. And if you go to Brazil now, you can find churches for the religion of humanity. And if you look actually at the Brazilian flag, it has in that little globe, it says Ordem and Progresso, which is the philosophy of Auguste Comte in a nutshell. And so there was one church for the religion of humanity in Manhattan, and Herbert Croly was one of the few people who was ever baptized into the religion of humanity in the United States. And his father told him, hey, you're going to be a great philosopher. You've got to keep the philosophy of Auguste Comte going. His crazy father's pressure was totally debilitating to him. And Herbert Croly had breakdown after breakdown and couldn't graduate from Harvard and ended up marrying a rich woman and kind of leading this genteel life. He was an architecture critic, played a lot of tennis, a lot of bridge. But when he gets to be about 40 years old, he sees like all the pressure from his father kind of existing on his shoulders, and he says, what the heck? I'm going to make one last great run at it. And so he writes this book, The Promise of American Life, which is digressive, has all sorts of big theories in it. But the primary theory is one that he ended up stealing from Auguste Comte, which was Comte believed that an industrial society needed to have a strong state that managed the problems of industrial society. And so Croly took that idea, ran with it, made this great case for government. This couple, the Straits, read it on their honeymoon and said, my God, we should meet this guy. And so they get back from their honeymoon, they call up old Herbert Croly, invite him for lunch on Long Island, and over the course of lunch, they decide that they're going to start a magazine. And that magazine becomes the New Republic. And so that political age had many of the same essential questions that faces us now. It had a government that was dominated by special interests. It was the rise of a new economy, just as in that day it was an industrial economy, and they were wrestling with the implications of a new industrial economy, which had reshaped a lot of social relationships, reshaped a lot of economic relationships, remade politics. And today we have a rise of an information economy that has had similarly widespread ramifications for our political and economic life. Our government is dominated by interest in much the same way that it was now. But in 1912, there was a whole political vocabulary that was designed and to deal with those crises. There was a whole politics that emerged from that political vocabulary that was designed to address those. And so in the election of 1912, you had 4 separate political candidates all claiming to represent the mantle of reform. And so it is a bit despair-inducing that you look at our contemporary scene, you see much the same problems, but you don't see a politics designed to respond to them. There is no reform movement in this country now. The same questions about corporate size that dominated political discourse in 1912 pretty much go ignored now. So I say despair away. That's where all the evidence points.
Well, we had the problem at that time of the trusts.
Yes.
And Standard Oil and the Sherman Antitrust Act and all of these other attempts to control the railroads, and the muckrakers were at work. But today we've got a different kind of corporation. We've got a different, it doesn't necessarily have hardware. But
Yes.
in terms of power, I think you'd agree. Rockefeller had no idea at all, or he didn't come close to the amount of power that the present multinational information corporations have. They're almost states unto themselves.
I mean, it's a little different. I mean, I think you do see tremendous concentrations of economic power exerting themselves on the political system. You look at the Koch brothers. I mean, just the size of their fortune is immense, and they don't really. There are no laws that stop them from spending it kind of almost infinitely on the political system. But the Kochs aren't a trust in the way that Standard Oil was, but you do have the rise of a whole series of new corporations that may not quite have the same sort of dangerous political power, but do exert tremendous influence on our lives and on our economy, and aren't addressed in the same sort of way. And it may not be popular to say this in San Francisco, but you look at a company like Google. I mean, Google is very different than Standard Oil, and I don't think it's it's not nefarious in the way that Standard Oil is, but Google does. It is this choke point for knowledge, and Standard Oil was a choke point for all parts of our economic system, and it was in bed with railroads and. But we haven't really wrestled with the implications of a company like Google. We've begun to do it a little bit when it comes to privacy, but not much. And you look at the way that it performs, there was an old term of art that they would use in the 19-teens to describe a company that just so dominated something in the way that Google dominates search. And it was called a natural monopoly. It was almost close to a public utility. And you look at the function that Google performs for us in our everyday lives, it is almost close to a utility. Does that mean that we should regulate it like a utility? I would be loath to go there, because I think that there are all sorts of, do you want government necessarily being the one to tell you which search term is best? But maybe there's a governmental interest in trying to create greater competition in that area. These are questions that should be important, that we should be discussing, but we really don't.
Going back to your original premise about how the new republic was founded, and the premise was that an industrial state, if I'm not misquoting you, an industrial state not only could do good for people, but it should do good for people.
Right.
I think we're pretty ambivalent about that now.
Well, they were ambivalent about it too back then. The debate then, it's an interesting debate. If you go back and you look at the way that corporate size was discussed in the election of 1912, and the way that Herbert Croly talked about it versus the way that Louis Brandeis talked about it. Herbert Croly was aligned with Theodore Roosevelt in the election, in that election, and they said, look, corporate size is inevitable. Big corporations are an inevitable byproduct of the industrial age, and big corporations can do a lot of good. They make life more convenient in certain ways. It's a rational way to organize an economy, and so we have to resign ourselves to corporate bigness. But Teddy Roosevelt in 1912 was essentially a socialist. He said, we need to give these guys licenses, federal licenses, and if they abuse their power, we'll take away their license and essentially nationalize them. That was his position versus Louis Brandeis and Woodrow Wilson, who said, look, we need to come in, we need to break up these big corporations, because bigness is a sin. It's a curse. That was Brandeis's phrase, the curse of bigness. And we need to create much smaller units in our economy who compete against each other vigorously. That's the healthy state, not to have one big thing, but to have lots of little guys duking it out. And the question is, looking back over the century, who was right there? And it's pretty hard to disentangle it. We ended up kind of muddling through, adopting a little bit of one attitude and a little bit of another attitude, but never really resolving that ultimate question about the virtue or the villainy of economic size. And so we're kind of we basically resigned ourselves to bigness at the end of the day.
Well, the theme, I think you would agree, of the book in this wonderful collection of essays is kind of the evolution of what we call liberalism.
Yes.
And liberal thought. Now, the one thing I am particularly sensitive to is that at the time you were, one of your authors wrote about Sacco and Vanzetti.
Yes.
One of the most horrible injustices, I think, that we've.
Yeah.
The United States was lynching black people on average maybe once every couple of months. There was never an essay that I saw about that.
Yeah.
This, to me, was worrisome because I think it kind of reveals a weakness in liberal thought. It's hard to reconcile it with the racial complexion, the racial identity of the United States.
But I mean race does appear in the book in various moments, and race was, I mean, it was something that they wrote about. I mean, Du Bois wrote some essays for the New Republic. It was part of the story. I mean, I think that, and the magazine published Langston Hughes and Ralph Ellison at various early stages in their career. What I tried to do in the book was to stitch together a story. So the magazine invented the term liberalism as we know it. When the magazine came around, when people used the word liberal, they mostly meant laissez-faire. They meant an economy where the free market ran itself and the state kept its hands off things. And the magazine turned it on its head in the 19-teens and started to use liberal in the way that we use it now when we throw it around in our political discourse. And so I tried to have that story of liberalism kind of stitched together through the essays, but there's also a lot of cultural stuff in the piece. And I start off with an essay by the great English critic Rebecca West called The Duty of Harsh Criticism, which has its own funny backstory. Please. Can I digress again? Rebecca West wrote this magnificent piece at the age of 22. And Rebecca West had this just obviously a meteoric ascent if she's writing pieces at the age of 22. She first came to the attention of the novelist H.G. Wells because she'd written a negative review of one of his books. She called him the old maid of English literature. And so Wells, in an attempt to kind of disarm this young critic, invited her over. One thing led to another, a few drinks here and there. Suddenly, they're having a torrid love affair. And so Rebecca West writes this piece for us in 1914. It was in issue #1 of the magazine. And the piece is written in the shadow of war, which is just breaking out in Europe in 1914. And she's arguing that even though war is here, we shouldn't go soft in the way that we talk about art and literature. We need to be just as tough as we ever were. And people are going soft now. Just look at the way that H.G. Wells is being treated. H.G. Wells is, nobody's criticizing this guy for his poor novels, his mediocre work. And 2 months before that piece appeared, she had H.G. Wells' child. Not disclosed in the magazine, but it's one of those pieces that I recommend. When we actually started a book review site, on our book review section on our website, we tacked her essay up in the corner of the webpage, so it would always be there. And it's one of those pieces that, as a critic, you need to read every couple months to buck yourself up, to remember your job isn't to go soft on people. It isn't just to praise stuff that's mediocre. That you need to always adhere to your highest standard.
Are there any other interesting backstories you're sitting on that are covered in some of those essays you want to talk about?
Oh, I mean, every essay in this has a backstory of some sort of another, and that's one of the. I grew up. I mean, I should say, I grew up in a household where my father was a New Republic reader. He started reading the magazine when he was in high school, and when I would go to sleep, he'd slip, when I was a teenager, he'd slip the magazine under my door. And so I grew up kind of with the magazine held up in my household as a paragon of a certain type of seriousness in the way that we think about politics and we think about culture. And so in some ways, I felt like I actually didn't even intend to write these little squibs, these introductions that I wrote at the beginning of each essay. But it was a one thing leads to another type of deal where I just thought, well, this needs a little bit of explanation. H.G. Wells' affair with Rebecca West can't go unnoted, and so I started writing up a little introduction for that one, and then a little introduction for the next one, and then one thing led to another.
Well, some of the most interesting reads in there are personal attacks. I think the essay about Norman Mailer's book on religion, I thought was really rich.
Right. So that was written by James Wood, who was our great literary critic for many years and is now the New Yorker's great literary critic. And so, I mean, it's a question. Like, the magazine has fists, and that's always been one of the characteristics of it. So that it goes back to that first essay about the duty of harsh criticism, and it's been one of the things that has defined the magazine, is that it's had a fearlessness that sometimes borders on recklessness, but that is always entertaining and kind of serves a higher purpose at its best.
No, let's look again to today. Obviously, the New Republic in its heyday, when Walter Lippmann was sitting in the chair, was tremendously influential. Is there any counterpart today? The media world seems to, first of all, the business model dropped out, and then there's a proliferation of ideas, irresponsible assertions, all of that. Is there any publication or agency that you can think of that commands that same kind of role as having integrity, having guidance responsibly for the country?
So it's true the magazine was born with a kind of spirit of elitism. It had relations with, now I'm hung up on the early part right now in this discussion. So in like the Woodrow Wilson administration, it was so Walter Lippmann, who you mentioned, would go to have lunch with Colonel House, who was Woodrow Wilson's right-hand man, at his apartment on Park Avenue, and he would curry favor with Walter Lippmann, and Lippmann would curry favor back with the Wilson administration, for better or for worse, a lot of times for worse. And when an issue of the New Republic would come out, stockbrokers would go buy it to try to discern which way the Woodrow Wilson administration was going, so that they'd get a jump on the market. That kind of elitism, there's still a little bit of it in the magazine, and I think it's actually kind of healthy for a sense of identity and for a sense of mission. And this ties back to what we were talking about, cultural standards. I mean, there's so much dreck in our culture right now. I mean, the impulse on the internet is towards mass audience, and when you start thinking too deeply about mass audience, it's inherently corrupting. I mean, you begin to pander to the crowd. And so I would defend elitism to a certain extent, not fully, but I think that what we see right now is that authority in our culture has essentially collapsed. And it's been a slow collapse, and some of it's been a healthy collapse, but there are just not very many institutions in our culture that command authority, that have that sort of definitive influence anymore. And I think that's only been further accelerated by the arrival of a lot of forms of new media, which offer tremendous opportunities to a magazine like ours. When we publish a piece that's a hit, it's really a hit. We published this piece about Ivy League education. It was a very provocative piece, and it was done. You know, when I slapped the headline, "Don't send your kid to the Ivy League" on the piece, I kind of had it in my gut that it was going to be a piece that I knew I was pandering a little bit to a certain sort of populist instinct. But that piece had 2 million readers, which the New Republic in 1960, I read once, didn't have enough readers to fill up the University of Mississippi football stadium, and so it's a different world. Like so nobody has a monopoly on influence, but the possibilities of influence are almost infinite now.
You know, I can't help but want to take a step back and look at the broader present day.
Yes.
Where we are awash in information, we're awash in different vehicles.
Yes.
24-hour news channel, talk radio, whatever. And I can't help but think we're worse off. We're worse off, I mean, I'm not talking materially, I'm just talking about the kind of confidence that we used to have. I would say even, you know, up to, I would say the assassination of John Kennedy was a big turning point. But yeah. I'm trying to remember the country as it existed at a time when we had tremendous problems. There was a whole problem of integration. Mm-hmm. And there were relatively few vehicles or agencies for information. There were the elite newspapers, 3 networks, and we were able to handle those problems because, as you were saying before, there were authority figures that actually deserved authority. Now we have a tremendous volume of information, we have tremendous problems, and we aren't even close. It seems as though every time I wake up and I look at my menu for the things I want to read, it seems like every other day something else has gone haywire. Yeah. I'm talking about the, you know, the 4 horsemen. We're talking about war, pestilence, yeah, starvation, whatever.
I don't know if there was ever. I don't think there was ever a golden age of media. I mean, I don't. I think that you look at Walter Lippmann. He had authority, but he was also kissing the ass of people in public power. I mean, he did take a very courageous stand against the Vietnam War at a very early stage. That was extremely important. But he had a deeply flawed sort of career, and I think the career of media as a whole has been deeply flawed throughout. And I look at some of the changes now. Some of them are truly liberating. I think that we had an age where pundits were able to spout off unchallenged, and now that's not possible anymore. I'll say something stupid at this event tonight, and somebody here will tweet it, and I'll be ridiculed for it, and rightly so. And that's accountability, and that's good. And it has been democratized to an extent, and that's both good and bad. And so some of the things that make me, if you want to nail me down as a pessimist, color me a pessimist for a couple of reasons. One is I think that there was an idea of seriousness that has existed in our culture for, that's been a fixture of our culture, that there was a type of writing and thinking about the culture itself, about art, and about politics, and I think a lot of that has lost its cachet. Intellectuals and intellectualism doesn't really exist in our society. I think intellectuals have kind of taken it on the nose more than anybody for a variety of economic reasons, and their prestige has evaporated. And I think that the end of intellectuals, if I can be pompous, is not a great thing for our society. I wish culture got taken more seriously in our country. There was, you look back at the 1950s and 1960s, a lot of bad things about our culture during that period. A lot of conformism, a lot of infected by racism, by patriarchal attitudes, etc. But there was a great part of that culture, which was that mass media aspired to try to teach people things about culture. So Time magazine would put famous philosophers, famous musicians on its cover. Media felt an obligation to try to improve the standing of the culture, and I think that's completely disappeared, and so you're left with a lot of the garbage that dominates now.
We have a question here from the audience, and it follows up on some of the things you just mentioned about the nature of how we get our news and information. The question is, can you comment on sponsored content featured on news websites and publications? Next Gen Climate Thermometer being hosted on the New Republic website.
So it's a good question. So one of the advertising has essentially collapsed as conventional advertising has collapsed as a revenue vehicle for journalism. If you look at the New Yorker, look at how many ad pages are in the New Yorker. There's maybe 1 or 2 ad pages in the New Yorker. We never had ads, so it's a different sort of conundrum for us. And so the question is, how does media make money? And one thing that has been that media is experimenting with on a fairly wide level is something called sponsor content. And on the New York Times website, on the New Republic's website, on BuzzFeed's website, certainly, you'll see articles that are written by advertisers, hopefully, boxed off and signaled as that it's sponsored, that it's not normal editorial content, and there are a lot of people who've criticized this model because they say that it confuses readers into clicking on something that's an ad when it's they think it's editorial when it's really an ad, and I think it's worth thinking through the implications of all these sorts of things. Ultimately, advertising exists. It's a fact. There's no denying it. Media can't exist if it doesn't have advertisers supporting it. And so we kind of venture off into these experiments, which you hope ultimately are both good for your advertisers, don't thoroughly confuse your readers, don't do anything to assault the editorial credibility of the organizations that publish them. I think I've been, it's something I think about all the time, and I'm constantly wrestling with. But I come down on the side of, you need advertising. It's just a fact.
I think it's fair to say nobody has figured this out.
No.
It's a constant. Somebody has to pay somebody to go out and find out something. And since, I guess, maybe around 2005, there's less and less of that happening. Fewer and fewer people are available to actually originate information because of the collapse of the business model. Do you want to talk?
I'd say if everybody in this room subscribed to the New Republic tomorrow and you told all your friends to subscribe to the New Republic, then we wouldn't need to rely on advertisers, and you put this whole question to bed.
Absolutely. It's like saying everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. the whole market collapsed because people got something for free. They thought it was for free, but there's never anything that's free. Let's move on to another question. This also submitted by someone here in the audience, and this refers to the essay by Chris Hughes that closes with "Mind without silos the next 100 years." Mr. Foer, what solutions will the New Republic offer going into the next presidential election?
Solutions.
Yeah, that's what they said.
You want solutions? I got problems for you. I'm not entirely sure what that means.
Well, I think they want to know, who do you think out there on that spectrum might be the least objectionable?
So, I mean, on that score, I mean, I think one thing I wouldn't mind seeing, both as a political journalist and as somebody who cares about the outcomes of elections, is some sort of contest. I mean, I think it would be good for Hillary Clinton as a general election candidate to be tested somewhat in primary. Not that she wasn't tested, maybe didn't pass that test in 2008, but that was a contest that ultimately, a good primary contest ultimately yield good general election candidates. You get rusty if you're not campaigning. You say things that aren't challenged, and you don't refine your rhetoric. So I think it's important. I think it's important that there be some sort of contest. The problem being, it doesn't seem like there's any Democrat who's especially eager at this stage, any credible Democrat who's especially eager at this stage to challenge Hillary Clinton.
Do you find that is the present polarization between the parties, in your opinion, as pronounced as it was in 1912? It seems to me it's more pronounced now.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, it's for the first time in our history, we have purely ideological parties. And is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? I mean, it's certainly not great for governing because it makes it hard to craft compromises. It makes it hard to find middle ground. Everything becomes a death struggle with the next election in mind. So that doesn't seem to me especially great. But I don't actually see any reversing of that either. I mean, once you get locked in a pattern like that, it takes some sort of shock to the system to change it. And in 1912, one of the shocks to the system was that Teddy Roosevelt created a third party. Now, everybody who's talked about creating a third party in this country, mostly have talked about doing it. You had Ralph Nader, obviously, who did that to perhaps ill effect in the 2000 election. And then a lot of the discussion since then has been about creating a centrist political party. And I think that there's probably a little bit of space there, but not a whole lot. When Michael Bloomberg talked about creating a third party in 2008, he talked about creating a party that sounded a lot to me like the Democratic Party. I mean, the problem is that the Democratic Party spans basically the center to the left, and the Republican Party is the center right to the loony right. And so maybe the only little sliver of space is between the center and the center right, and there's just not a whole lot of people who live there. Or maybe there are a lot of people who live there, and we just don't know it.
Let's have another question from the audience. Can you comment on how the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 made the capitalist world feel it had won, and that capitalism is the only way to organize economic relations?
All right. An end of history question. So I think after the fall of communism, there was a considerable deal of triumphalism that the West, liberal democracy felt. And the great statement of that was that Francis Fukuyama essay about the end of history. And it was like we'd found the model that all of history had pointed towards, and all the world was suddenly going to settle around that model, and we would have peace and harmony and prosperity forevermore. And of course, that didn't happen. I actually, you look around at liberal democracy in the world, I don't see any model of government that is superior to it. But I also think that liberal democracy is fairly broken in certain ways, and not just in the United States, but also in Europe and in other parts of the world. I mean, you look at the extent of gridlock and non-participation in our system. You look at the way in which it just doesn't have its act together to deal with a lot of its fundamental problems, and you can't even you have an existential problem like climate change, and you can't even imagine the political system even beginning to address it in the most sort of basic ways. I mean, that's a broken system. You look at Europe. I mean, I think Vladimir Putin is kind of walking all over Europe in a lot of sort of ways, and holds them completely hostage. And you look at their kind of impotent in the face of it. And you look at they have their own massive economic problems that are fairly structural, and they're incapable of dealing with them. And so what's the solution to a broken liberal democratic system? It only gets solved if you have reform movements that are able to rally public opinion to try to address some of the core structural flaws in our system. And what's depressing as hell to me is like you look at the influence of money on elections. It's possible in some ways to overstate the influence of money on elections, but it's real, and it has a huge impact, and it affects so many political calculations that people make in this country. The Supreme Court has basically conceded that it's money run amok, and there's no way for nobody in the public seems to really give a damn about it. So we're stuck. Sorry.
What would you say is the core of what is the poisonous tree as opposed to the fruit of the poisonous tree? What issue would you say is central to reform before anything else happens?
I would put the money issue at the core of it. I really
money in politics.
Yeah.
That would amount to the Supreme Court overturning.
Yeah, Citizens United.
And that
but it wasn't like it was exactly working beautifully before
yeah.
then. But I think that when John McCain talked about campaign finance reform, I think he talked about it really smartly. And he said that what you have to do is you have to be eternally vigilant. You create structures for reform. The interests outsmart the structures for reform. And then you bulk up to fight the last war, and you improve the system a little bit. Then they fight back, and they screw it up again, and then you reform it. You have to reform it some more. Reform is something that it's an organism that needs to be tended to, that you can't allow to wither. But now reform is essentially not possible. And so where do you go? Do you have a constitutional convention that changes the way that we regard money as speech? That's not going to happen. It's depressing. It starts with political pressure. The public has to care in order for anything else to happen.
In a practical sense, would Citizens United be reversible other than a constitutional amendment?
I think you could Congress could try to legislate various things, and it would get fought out in the courts. Who knows?
Question from the audience. The November 2014 Harper's article titled "Say No to Hillary" is a bold article on our coming 2016 election. Does the New Republic take these kinds of risks? Question mark.
Well, funny you should mention it. Obviously written by a non-reader. Because we published about a year ago, a piece about Elizabeth Warren that Noam Schreiber, one of our writers, had written, making the case for an Elizabeth Warren candidacy. We published an interesting piece by Rebecca Traister, who is one of our writers who's a feminist, and she made the argument that Hillary needed to be challenged by another woman in the upcoming election. I personally, I don't have. I mean, I think there's a lot about Hillary Clinton as a public servant, as a potential president, that I find fairly attractive, and I think that she could be. I think that there's a possibility that she could be a very solid president. So I don't come down on that issue one way or the other very strongly, but I do think it's worth having a robust debate about.
A question from the audience, following up on your appeal a moment ago to have everybody subscribe. You mentioned if everyone in this room and all their friends subscribed to the New Republic, they wouldn't need ads. If the benefit of quote-unquote elitism is intellectualism, which we are in need of, why aren't there more models that rely solely on subscribers? Why doesn't the New Republic? I think you do. Just the magazine is solely paid for by subscription.
Right. So just one of the problems with the economics of subscriptions is that in order to get the next subscription, you have to spend a lot of money. There are very, very few vehicles for getting new subscribers. One is direct mail, and so I could buy a list and craft material and send it to your home in the mail, where you get lots of junk already. And besides, if it arrives via snail mail, you probably dismiss it to begin with. But if I could make a calculation that if I spent $60, I could get a new subscriber, and over the lifetime, your subscription to me would be worth $80 or something, and so that would be worth it. But even our beneficent owner doesn't like to spend that much money to go mining for that kind of return. You can get subscriptions via Facebook ads and via the internet, and that'll yield some. But we're just not accustomed to subscribing to magazines or paying for our articles and our news, and it's a cultural shift that's very, very hard to overcome.
What is your distribution of subscriptions to the magazine now? What does it look like geographically? Since you're located in Washington, most of your stuff has to do with Washington policies.
I think everybody in this room could guess what our
it's all Eastern Seaboard, right?
Well, Eastern and Western. I mean, I was always shocked that Los Angeles was our second largest city, but then again, it's our second largest city.
But
it's not as concentrated in Washington D.C. as you would expect.
Your first would be New York, right?
Yeah, it goes New York, L.A., D.C.
Okay, given all you have covered about the changing information in society, how will the New Republic measure its success? Are the markers of success, subscription rolls, etc., even relevant?
Another good, strong, tough question here. So, to me, as an editor, the thing that matters most is impact. The people who run my business may not like me saying that, but it's true. Like, I care. I'm in this business in order to publish articles that change people's minds, that get them to think about a problem that they've never considered before, to publish a piece of reporting that helps them understand the world that they live in a little bit better, to publish beautiful essays about art or beautiful pieces of narrative reporting, all of which have implicit arguments in them. That's one of the things that distinguishes the New Republic, I think, from some other magazines that we hope to compete with, we like to think we compete with, which is that we began as a journal of opinion, and so argumentation is in our DNA. And so even when we publish narrative journalism, which we do quite a bit, it has to add up to it has to add up to some sort of statement about our world. You don't need to hit the reader over the head with it, but it needs to exist in there somewhere.
You know, it seems as though we live in a society, because of the availability of gadgets like phones and tablets and everything, that our attention spans have shortened. And I'm not talking just about millennials, I'm talking about everybody. Do you have a sense that that's true? Have your articles shortened any? Have you?
It's actually, it's a little bit ironic. I mean, there are a couple ironies for us. One is that the magazine was bought by a co-founder of Facebook, and he has a real commitment to some old-fashioned styles of journalism. So as a result, we ended up we publish essays and pieces of reportage now that are several orders of magnitude longer than we did in 1912 or that we did in 1960. And that's fairly liberating for us. But on balance, what you're saying is undoubtedly true, that attention spans over time have probably diminished. But you also see that there is a huge appetite for what they call long-form journalism, which is a phrase that I don't like because it implies that the people who produce it sounds a little bit precious. It sounds like you're some cheesemaker in Berkeley or something, that
we make a lot of cheese in Berkeley.
Yeah. And I don't like that feeling that you're doing something that's artisanal, because it implies that it's somehow out of step with the times. But just as you know, people dig artisanal cheese now, people dig kind of the artisanal forms of information, and that type of long-form journalism, I think, falls into that category, where it may not have quite the mass niche that it did in, say, like the 1960s, but there is a good niche for it.
You know, you're exactly the person I want to ask this question to, because it bears upon what I do for a living, which is teach journalism.
Yeah.
And we've been in this power struggle for years now about should we teach long-form journalism? Students demand it. They want to do that. They want to have that experience of doing these long, introspective, narrative pieces. They want to go back to, you know, some country in Europe and trace their ancestors and come to some grand conclusion, as opposed to what it seems the market demands, which is people to go live, like now, and quick and dirty, and get there, run and gun, because this is what the news cycle looks like.
It's bad, but it's not quite as bad as you described. So if you look at an organization like BuzzFeed, or you look at Mike, Policy Mike, these newfangled internet organizations, they start off producing the quick hit stuff, but ultimately they still see the need to produce long form. BuzzFeed produces some deeply reported pieces. Why do they do that? Because they care about, you know, once they've established a volume of audience, they need to establish their credibility with advertisers. And the way they establish their credibility with advertisers is ultimately they feel like they have to produce at least some serious, well-crafted, deeply reported material. And so, but the question is an interesting question. Like, can I defend the teaching, the craft that goes into producing these long-form pieces of journalism? And I'll just give you a little snapshot into what happens when we do it. So, so we will send somebody to the Central African Republic to report about the genocide that's happening there. And when we send somebody there, we say, look, you're going there to produce a crackling piece. You've got to make people care about the Central African Republic. This is for a publication in the United States of America. The bar there is extremely high. People are just not inherently interested in anything that happens in Africa, let alone bad news that happens in Africa. And so we have to get funding for that guy to go there. And so we go to a foundation and we ask them for money, and so you have to apply for a grant process to have him go. And then he goes with the translator and you hope a photographer, and puts himself in danger. This is maybe an extreme example, but he has to stay on the ground there for weeks in order to get the type of material that he needs to come back to craft a story, because it's not just enough to go to a danger zone and just fill up your notebook with the things that you observe. Long-form journalism at its best is there's a narrative there. So you have to have characters. You have to have human elements that you can attach yourself to. And you can't just have static human elements. You can't just go take a snapshot of an individual, describe them. You have to be able to tell a story about an individual. And in order to elicit that story from the individual, you have to, A, talk to them, earn their trust, be able to get them to tell you all sorts of private information that they had never ever thought about broadcasting to a wider world. You have to be able to observe them in their environment so that you can not just you can describe things as it's happening. There needs to be motion in a story. You need to be able to not just set a scene, describe a scene. You need to be able to describe something where there's actually things that are happening. And then so the person comes, the writer comes, they shove all this stuff into their notebook, and then they come back and they write. And then there's no writer in the world who turns in a perfect first draft. The writers in The New Yorker who you think you worship for their writing skills, I've seen a lot of their first drafts. They suck. And it takes a lot of work in order to elicit it. The mind plays all sorts of tricks on you. No human being is able to see the flaws in their own work. And it's just hard. It's hard to be able to tell a story. And it's hard to tell a story about things that, like I said, people don't care about. And it's even harder to tell a story when you're not just trying to describe what some spy did in Poland in 1939, or to tell a story about going to Italy to eat pasta. But when you're telling a story about a genocide where it's they're good guys and they're bad guys, but the good guys aren't that good and the bad guys have been victimized on their own, you have to squeeze so much nuance into there, and it just takes work. And so you go back and forth on drafts with the writer, and it takes not just one draft, not just two drafts, it takes like dozens of drafts, literally dozens of drafts, and it's painful, and the writer's begging you for mercy. Just publish my goddamn story. I went to Africa, in Central African Republic, I had genocidal maniacs chasing me down the street. The least you can do for me is publish my freaking story. And you say, no, 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 you put yourself at risk, you did this because it's important, and we're gonna do it right. And that means that we're going to have to just keep going through drafts. And then when we're done with the drafts, we're going to fact check the hell out of your piece, because we're one of the few places in the world anymore that cares about fact checkers. And so that's going to be a painful process, because your fact checker, and there are a couple former fact checkers here in the room, they're going to have to speak French, and they're going to have to call the Central African Republic and talk to people who are going to tell you that your writer is lying through their teeth. And you're going to have to interrogate them to see if they have a shred of opinion. And then we're going to just keep your pieces in galleys now. And we're just going to keep massaging the hell out of your prose, because there's no sentence that is a perfect sentence, and we're going to keep at it. Why? Because in the end, it's like we love it, and we think it's the most important thing in the world. And if we don't apply that kind of devotion to producing it, your standards start to slip, and you say, well, look, we can't fact check a piece in the Central African Republic. We'll just take the author's view of things. Well, I mean, we are the publication that published Stephen Glass, so we can't really quite go there. But that devotion. I mean, it's like everything else. Like you have to have that devotion to standards. Because if you don't, it all becomes things that fade after you read them quickly. That if you're trying to really make an impact in the world, you gotta go full bore.
That was a passionate answer. We've got time for one more question. This is a follow-up. Your literary editor recently stated, "A thoughtless citizen of a democracy is a delinquent citizen of a democracy." Your thoughts on this, and how does the New Republic approach this? Also, what is it like to work with him?
Okay. So such an inside knowing question that they didn't even mention the name of our literary editor, who's a figure called Leon Wieseltier. And I really recommend watching him on, that came from the Colbert Report, where he was on. And he's like the least likely guy to ever appear on the Colbert Report. And that made it one of the great pieces of television of modern times, because he and Colbert ended up having basically a discussion about philosophy, but not just like philosophy at a highfalutin level, but philosophy at a very basic level about how we live our lives and how we think about how we live our lives and the standards that we hold for ourselves, what makes us happy. These are kind of primary questions. And Leon is a little bit of a polarizing figure, to be sure, because he's got strong opinions about everything. He likes to attack people, or I mean, I guess that's the way you'd put it. But he's also trained as a philosopher, and he writes about things in a very, very different sort of way. And so there are a lot of people who worship him, a lot of people who can't stand him, but he writes about things in a way that always makes you think and always returns you to first principles. And that to me is an extremely rare thing, to have writing in a publication with maybe not the biggest audience in the world, but with an audience that actually calls you to think about what it means to live a good life. What role should morality have in the formulation of our policy? And you may not like his conclusions, as I said, but at least he's forcing the question. And I admire the hell out of him for doing that.
That concludes our program for this evening. On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I ask you to join me in thanking Franklin Foer for this excellent discussion.